This is Asian Insider and I'm Nirmal Ghosh. Now in India, the government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi in September passed 3 new pieces of legislation aimed at deregulating the farm sector. Farmers, already under considerable stress, see the farm bills, as they are called, as having been passed without adequate consultation and basically favoring corporate interests, not theirs. So tens of thousands trundled to New Delhi in protest on foot and in convoys of tractors and trucks. At the border, they were met with water cannons and tear gas, which only strengthened their resolve. This has become a major challenge to the strongman Prime Minister. To discuss the ramifications of these farmer protests, we have today Dr. Aparna Pandey, Research Fellow and Director of the Initiative on the Future of India and South Asia at the Hudson Institute here in DC. And we have Straits Times India Bureau Chief Nirmala Ganapathy in New Delhi. Thanks a lot for joining us today. Nirmala, if I may start with you, can you give us some quick history as to the core issues? This is not the first farmers' protest in India. What is different this time around?
I think Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who's been in power since 2014 and he's well into his second term, has not faced a protest like this before. He has, since coming to power, he has been on a reform agenda. He has, brought in some major reforms, like in 2017, he brought in the goods and services tax, and so on and so forth. And these 3 farm laws are, one of the biggest agriculture reform that India has seen in years, and the agriculture sector is in dire need of reforms. It's beset by a series of problems, from failure to boost productivity, the dependence of farmers on rains and growing costs of fertilizer and seeds, which makes farming a very tough proposition in India. This protest has hit the government really hard. You have tens of thousands of farmers who are on several points along the Delhi border, and they are in no mood to kind of compromise. They want a repeal of these 3 farm laws. And there have been 6 rounds of talks with the government, and so far it's not yielded any results, in the sense that the government has been willing to backtrack on some points and kind of assure them of price support from the government, but that hasn't been enough. So it's truly a huge challenge for the Modi government, because at this point, the farmers have refused, and, to take back a law, to repeal a law would really set quite a bad precedent in a way. And I don't think that's happened, that, there have been laws which have been repealed because they've become obsolete. But I don't think we've seen, a law being repealed which was passed by Parliament, soon after. So yeah, it is a huge challenge. And many people are comparing these protests to what happened in the 80s. During the late and former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's tenure, where 500,000 farmers occupied central Delhi. And at that time, within a week, the government had kind of listened to the farmers and given into their demands, which included waivers on electricity dues, etc. So the farmer protests have been going on for nearly a month, and they are showing little signs of dispersing. They're quite adamant that they want a repeal of all the 3 farm laws, and are not willing to meet the government halfway. So clearly the government has a challenge on its hand.
So is this, do the farmers have a point? Is this another case of abrupt deregulation, like we saw in Modi 1 with the demonetization? Because the farmers say they weren't consulted, but they have been consulted. But do they have a point?
I think they do have a point, because, the 3 laws, basically the laws, what it will do is allow farmers to directly sell to private companies. It facilitates that sale. It cuts out these government regulated wholesale markets and commissioning agents. But for farmers, this is a system that they are comfortable with. This is a system that helps them. For instance, a lot of farmers, talk about how commissioning agents give them a lot of leeway when it comes to buying their produce. There are instances of how they take money from these commissioning agents and perhaps give them the produce 6 months later. So they act as an informal banking system in a way. So for these farmers, they are very scared that, once these laws are implemented, they will be also at the mercy of big corporates. So there is a lot of mistrust among farmers about big corporates. There is a sense that they will be taken advantage of. So there is a huge trust deficit here as well. And there are points. I mean, the farmers do have points, because they big corporate coming in, they're not comfortable with it. So you have to, I think the government needs to take the farmer along. It'll be difficult to kind of implement these laws, particularly in these parts.
Dr. Pandey, images of these protests have ricocheted around the world, and there are clearly international ramifications already. India's Minister of External Affairs the other day pulled out of a Canada-led international COVID meeting because Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had been critical of the Indian government over this. New Delhi, in fact, summoned Canada's High Commissioner to complain. Is this hurting India's image overseas?
Thanks, Nirmal. Pleasure to be back on Asian Insider. Actually, I guess what these protests show us are the three things, right? According to me. One, diaspora politics. When you have a large and diverse diaspora, like India does, that participates in domestic politics in countries where it lives, it's deeply integrated in those countries. It can be a positive. It helps bilateral relations, can also create challenges, because then leaders in other countries will comment on Indian internal politics. Second, all politics is local in every country, whether it's India, it's Canada, UK, or any other country around the world. So politicians in these countries, whether Prime Minister Trudeau or the 36 British MPs who wrote to Prime Minister Boris Johnson about these protests, they're doing it because they have constituencies where there are large numbers of Punjabis and Sikhs who have family members and who are therefore concerned about their family members back home in India. And third, these protests, we live in a day and age of social media. And so a protest in one part, in one country, will always have an impact around the world. There'll be those who are directly involved, and there'll be those who are either human rights or for civil rights or other issues. So it is natural for this to happen, even more natural when you have a diaspora which is as large as India's.
Okay, so there are some attempts in some sections of the diaspora to insert the Khalistan message. Now, for those watching or listening to us who are unfamiliar, the Khalistan movement of the early 1980s basically sought an independent homeland for Sikhs. It was a long and very bloody conflict. Some of us, I certainly lived through it in Delhi at the time. So we won't sort of focus too much on that because that requires hours of programming. But only recently, at a protest at the Indian Embassy here in DC, a Khalistan flag was draped over the head of the statue of Mohandas Gandhi. Granted, not all the protesters were enthusiastic about it, but the Khalistan messaging has re-emerged among sections of this diaspora, particularly in North America and the UK. Yet the farmers' protests are not about Khalistan. Can you pass that a bit for us?
Yes, so the farmers' protests are about what Nirmala mentioned earlier. There are problems, the Indian governments for a very long time have tried to bring about reforms in the agricultural sector. So the protests in Delhi and in Punjab and other parts of India are about the farm laws, and they have to do with internal domestic issues and differing views of the farmers or the lobbies or the government. Protests in most countries around the world, and the majority of these protests are protests by family members or by people who are affected directly or indirectly by what is happening. Some of them are family members, some of them are civil society or human rights activists. But yes, in these protests, we have noticed, just as we noticed in protests earlier this year when they were against the CAA, the anti-CAA, Citizenship Amendment Act of India, when those protests took place, that there were certain Khalistani groups, both in United States, in Canada, in UK, became part of these protests and tried to divert the main issue, which in this case is protest against the farm laws, towards a towards their issue, which is a demand for a referendum in Punjab and a demand for a Khalistani state. I mean, I'll give you two examples. Just in the last few months, there's a group based in the United States called Sikhs for Justice, and the leader of the Sikhs for Justice has actually written letters both to the Chinese Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Pakistani Premier Imran Khan, asking for support and pledging support of the Khalistani movement, both for China and for Pakistan, and asking their support in return.
So Nirmala, in Delhi, what is the situation at the moment? The Supreme Court has apparently quite recently ruled that the government should set up, and the unions who are backing the farmers should set up a mediation committee. Obviously, it would seem to be in the Modi government's interest to sort this issue out soon before it really gets out of hand and these other forces come into play. What is the thinking in Delhi?
The thinking in Delhi is, of course, the Modi government would like nothing better than to resolve this issue and for the farmers to basically go home. But it's become very complicated because the farm groups are quite insistent that they don't even want, moderators. They want they're quite adamant that they want a repeal of these farm laws. So it's a very tough situation for the Narendra Modi government for them to kind of negotiate with the farmers because I don't think the Modi government will be looking at a repeal of the farm laws. I mean, that will be very difficult and it would also set a precedent. So it's really a very tough situation. As I said earlier, Mr. Modi has had this reformer image since he came into power in 2014. So while his political standing is still quite high and he's still a popular leader, his reformist image may take may have an impact on his reformist image in a sense. So the situation is still quite volatile in a sense that there is no resolution so far. And there seems to be, I mean, so far, there's no way of saying how this is going to kind of evolve. For sure, it's a tough proposition for the government.
And Dr. Pandey, back to you for a last word, actually. Very quickly, do you think that these protests and the way the government in India has handled them are going to figure in, U.S. Congress in the incoming administration? We have a Joe Biden administration coming in early next year, January 20th, and the general perception is that they will be a little tougher on human rights issues. So do you think this will sour things a bit in terms of the rosy India-US relationship, or does a strategic relationship actually supersede all this?
I believe the strategic relationship supersedes all of this, but there will be discussions. If these protests last into January and February, then there will be discussions in the House, just as there were on the CAA and the events inside Kashmir. So I believe it sort of, it depends on how long these protests rise. But even if these protests do not continue till that time, there will be more discussion in a democratic administration on how the world's largest democracy does act inside its own country. And the fact, we need to remember, there are 4 million Indian Americans in this country. And so it's not just going to be a question of what happens inside India and India's domestic politics, but it's going to be in how Indian Americans view what is happening and what they tell their congressmen and senators.
Dr. Pandey, Nirmala Ganapathy, thank you very much for being on Asian Insider today. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Pleasure.
So as we've heard, these farmers' protests are ongoing and they present really the first big challenge for the Narendra Modi government, and they have international ramifications as well and could very well go out of hand. So it is definitely in the interests of the Indian government to find a settlement with the farmers. For Asian Insider, I'm Nirmal Ghosh.